One great myth in the United States is that Americans liberated the Philippines from Spanish rule. This lie is found in all school textbooks and is repeated in modern news articles, whose authors express dismay that Filipinos do not appreciate America's assistance. Americans are taught that on February 4, 1899, fighting broke out between American forces and Filipino insurgents, led by Emilio Alganado. The ensuing insurrection lasted 3 years and resulted in the death of 6,000 Americans and 20,000 Filipino combatants. Over 200,000 Filipino civilians died from violence, famine, and disease. Official American history suggests that no one is to blame for this unfortunate event. But the truth is that American imperialists ordered the U.S. Army to invade the Philippines in 1899 to destroy its new government and army to establish a colony. Spain had a presence in the Philippines since 1521, when famous explorer Ferdinand Magellan claimed these islands for the Queen of Spain. The locals disapproved and killed Magellan, and his Spanish force fled. There were already large kingdoms controlling much of these islands. The Spanish returned a few years later and used the war and alliances to establish dozens of forts as trading posts. But foreign rule was never accepted by the people of these islands. Frequent rebellions until 1896, when a large rebellion against Spanish colonial rule was orchestrated by wealthy and educated Filipinos. They assembled a modern army as they gradually defeated the scattered Spanish army garrisons throughout their nation. Filipino officers are here pictured in 1898. The Philippine Army grew into regiments with an officer corps, uniforms, cavalry, and artillery. Most officers were college-educated, many in Spain, and included dozens of former Spanish officers. By 1898, the once mighty Empire of Spain was collapsing as rebellions in the Philippines and Cuba sapped its strength. Spain had been militarily defeated in the Philippines. Its navy held on to its main naval base at Cavite, located on a narrow, easily defended peninsula in Manila Bay. Remnants of the Spanish colonial army held the fortified central part of Manila. Unless supplies and reinforcements arrived from Spain, these soldiers would be forced to surrender. In the United States, some wealthy Americans were anxious to establish an empire and manipulated public opinion until the U.S. Congress declared war to allow the U.S. military to seize parts of the collapsing Spanish Empire. The U.S. Navy had a squadron of ships deployed to Hong Kong. Soon after war was declared in April 1898, it sailed into Manila Bay and quickly sank 8 old Spanish warships sitting idle off Cavite. A few dozen U.S. Marines went ashore to accept surrender of the Cavite naval base. The general in charge of the 8,400 Spanish soldiers stranded nearby in Manila sent word that he wanted to surrender to the Americans too. The United States had declared war on Spain after demonizing its military as evil sadist, so leaving their fate to victorious Filipinos seems fair. However, that is not why the United States declared war. Several weeks later, on September 16, 1898, U.S. President William McKinley issued secret written instructions to his emissaries. Quote, "Incidental to our tenure in the Philippines is the commercial opportunity to which American statesmanship cannot be indifferent. It is just to use every legitimate means for the enlargement of American trade." Meanwhile, American generals in Cavite assured the new Philippine government, pictured at Cavite, that the United States was not an empire and had no colonies. The U.S. military would soon arrive to convince the encircled Spaniards in Manila to surrender. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army was mobilizing and assembling an entire Army Corps in California to invade and occupy the Philippines. So the Spanish were told to hang on because a rescue force was on the way. Spanish officers were from a proud empire, so cowards were court-martialed and imprisoned back home. Their officers secretly agreed to surrender, but only after brave skirmishes with American troops. As American infantry arrived in Manila, Filipino units escorted them to Spanish strongpoints. American and Spanish generals began what became known as the Mock Battle of Manila. 6 Americans were killed along with 49 Spaniards until white flags were hoisted and the Spanish surrendered to the Americans. Afterwards, American infantry units were scattered among Filipino infantry around Manila, guarding Spanish prisoners. American generals said they needed their own zones to prevent incidents among American troops with their prisoners and Filipino soldiers. This was granted by the Filipino government, but demands for larger zones were made as more American troops landed. Post-war treaty negotiations began in Paris between the United States and Spain. The Filipino government sent a delegation, but they were not allowed to attend. Spain thought it might be allowed to keep half the Philippines, but was only offered a petty sum of $20 million. Spain had no choice since it had already been expelled and had no real claim to the Philippines anyway. Senate passage of the Treaty of Paris was uncertain and involved a lengthy debate. Republican Senator George Frisbee Hoare proclaimed that the treaty, quote, will make us a vulgar, commonplace empire, controlling subject races and vassal states, in which one class must forever rule and the other classes must forever obey, end quote. Wealthy businessman Andrew Carnegie and former President Grover Cleveland petitioned the Senate to reject the treaty. These two men adamantly opposed such imperialist policies and participated in the American Anti-Imperialist League, along with other such prominent members like Mark Twain and Samuel Gompers. American ships continued to dock in Manila as more American troops arrived even after all the Spanish POWs had been evacuated. Tensions grew as excuses offered by American generals made no sense, and some bored American soldiers abused the locals, who they referred to as monkeys and niggers. Senate ratification was set for February 6, 1899, and passage was doubtful. As a result, on February 4th, the U.S. Army launched a surprise attack on Filipino forces around Manila with 21,000 troops. Filipino President Aguinaldo sent a member of his staff to see General Ewell Otis, the U.S. military commander in Manila, to demand a ceasefire. But Otis replied, quote, the fighting, having begun, must go on to the grim end. Battles occurred as American infantrymen attacked their nearby allies. The Philippine Army was overwhelmed, mostly because the Americans had mobile light artillery and new Gatling guns. During the first day, some 3,000 Filipinos were killed or wounded, while the Americans lost 250. With American soldiers now in battle, the controversial Treaty of Paris was approved by the Senate by a vote of 57 to 27, only one vote more than the two-thirds needed for a majority. The defeated Philippine Army withdrew north of Manila and fought a delaying action for months that resulted in several battles. American forces landed by ship elsewhere to conquer all the Philippines. Several cities refused to surrender, so they were bombarded by U.S. Navy warships, causing chaos as U.S. troops landed. An insurgency only developed months later, after the regular Philippine Army had been shattered and American troops became law enforcers. The U.S. Army even allowed black soldiers to take part in this imperial adventure, as this Library of Congress film shows. Was this exploitation or equal opportunity? To be fair, the colonization of the Philippines by Spain and then the United States contributed to the development of that nation, although these actions were mostly to support American business interests and to establish military bases for a growing American empire. Nevertheless, it is important to know that the United States didn't acquire the Philippines, since Spain never owned it and controlled no part by 1899. The United States invaded the Philippines and killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos, while over 6,000 Americans died for this imperial conquest.